My name is Mia. I'm 34, and 11 months ago, I bought my late husband's company back from the man who sold it out from under me, my own brother. Everyone at the closing table thought I was a private equity buyer named M. Callaway Holdings. Nobody in that room, including my brother, knew the buyer was me until the ink was already dry. Growing up, I was the daughter who fixed things quietly. My brother Grant was the one who got applauded for showing up. That imbalance followed us for 30 years, right up until the night my mother looked me in the eye at Thanksgiving and said, "You were never going to be the one who saved this family, Mia. That was always going to be Grant." I smiled, passed the gravy, and didn't say a word. I already had the paperwork in my bag. Let me take you back to where this really started, because you need to understand who I was before you understand what I became. If you're watching this tonight, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuned in from and what time it is right where you are. I want to know who's sitting with me for this one, because this story took me 9 years to live and about 4 months to be ready to finally tell. I grew up in Marsden Falls, a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place with one blinking traffic light and a diner called the Copper Kettle that's been open since 1961. My father, Walter Callaway, ran a mid-size industrial supply company called Callaway Fastening Solutions, nuts, bolts, precision hardware for manufacturing clients across 3 states. It wasn't glamorous, but by the time I was in high school it was pulling close to $4.2 million a year in revenue, and it fed our entire extended family. My brother Grant is 2 years older than me. He was the golden child in the most textbook way possible. Varsity quarterback at Marsden Falls High, homecoming king in 2007. The kind of charm that made teachers forgive late homework and made my mother, Diane, light up like a Christmas tree every time his name came up in conversation. I was quieter. I did debate club and worked at the Copper Kettle on weekends bussing tables for $6.15 an hour plus tips, and I read spreadsheets for fun, which nobody in my family understood or particularly cared to understand. When I was 19, I met Ethan Reyes at SUNY Albany in an intro accounting class neither of us needed but both of us happened to take. Ethan was 2 years older, sharp, funny in a dry way that took people a beat to catch, and he had this quiet intensity when he talked about wanting to build something of his own someday. We got married on June 8, 2013, in a backyard ceremony at his parents' house in Poughkeepsie, 42 guests, a rented arch draped in eucalyptus, and a 3-tier lemon cake his Aunt Rosa made from scratch. By 2016, Ethan had started a small industrial parts distribution company called Reyes Precision Supply out of a 2,400-square-foot warehouse in Kingston, New York. I worked days as a financial analyst at a regional bank and nights doing his books for free, because that's what you do when you love someone and you believe in what they're building. Within 4 years, Reyes Precision Supply was doing $6.8 million in annual revenue, servicing aerospace and defense subcontractors up and down the Hudson Valley corridor. Ethan was 33 years old and finally starting to breathe easy for the first time since I'd known him. Then on February 3, 2019, at 11:47 p.m., Ethan was driving home from a client dinner in Newburgh when a delivery truck ran a red light on Route 9W and hit his car broadside. He died at Vassar Brothers Medical Center 4 hours later at 3:52 a.m., with me holding his hand. He was 33. I was 27. We'd been married 5 years and 8 months. I inherited Reyes Precision Supply outright. Ethan's will was clean, drafted by an actual attorney the year before, no ambiguity. 100% ownership, transferred to me, Mia Reyes, as a sole beneficiary and surviving spouse. Here's where my family enters the story in a way that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. My father had passed away from a heart attack the year before Ethan, in March 2018, and Callaway Fastening Solutions had gone to my brother Grant. Not split between us, just handed to him, because my mother decided, without much discussion, that a business needs one clear leader, and that leader was obviously going to be her son. I didn't fight it at the time. I had my own life, my own marriage, my own thing building with Ethan. I told myself it didn't matter. But 3 months after Ethan died, while I was still sleeping 4 hours a night and forgetting to eat lunch most days, my mother sat me down at her kitchen table in Marsden Falls, the same table I'd done homework on as a kid, and said something I will never forget as long as I live. Grant thinks it would be smart for the family if he took over managing Rhea's precision for you. You're grieving, sweetheart. You shouldn't have to carry a whole company right now. Let him handle it. You can just collect a check. I want to be clear about something. Grant had never worked a single day in industrial parts distribution. He had run Callaway Fastening into modest but flat growth for a year, mostly living off the momentum my father had already built. He had zero relationship with Ethan's clients, zero understanding of the aerospace subcontracting compliance requirements that made up 60% of our revenue, and zero right, in my mind, to manage anything of Ethan's. I said no, calmly but completely. I appreciate that you're trying to help, Mom, but I'm running Rhea's precision. I'm not signing anything over to Grant. This is mine. This is what Ethan built, and I'm not handing it to anyone. That was the binary choice moment. That was the no that changed everything. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical, like the air pressure dropped. My mother's face did something I'd seen before but never fully understood until that moment. A kind of controlled disappointment, like she was recalculating exactly how much of her energy I was worth going forward. You've always thought you were smarter than this family, Mia, she said. Ethan's money has already gone to your head. I told her that wasn't fair, and it wasn't about money. It was about respecting what my husband built and trusting that I was capable of running it, which I had literally been doing successfully for 3 months already, on top of grieving him. 2 weeks later, on May 19th, 2019, we had a family dinner at my mother's house. Grant, his wife Kayla, my mother, and me. What started as a conversation about keeping the business in the family's best interest turned, over the course of about 45 minutes, into an ambush. Grant said it first. You know, Dad would want the businesses to be run together. It only makes sense for someone with actual leadership experience to guide things. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Mia. I'm trying to protect what's left of this family. I said, protect it from what, Grant? I'm not asking anyone to protect me. I'm asking everyone to respect a decision that isn't actually up for debate. My mother put her fork down. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as finality. If you're going to be the selfish, the stubborn, after everything this family has done for you, then maybe you need to think about whether you actually want to be part of it. I said, is that an ultimatum? She said, call it whatever you want. I looked at Grant. I looked at Kayla, who wouldn't meet my eyes. And I said, then I guess I know where I stand. Nobody stopped me when I stood up from that table. Nobody followed me to my car. I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. But I didn't cry. Not there, not in front of that house. I'd cried enough in the 4 months since Ethan died. That night, something in me went very still and very clear instead. 3 days later, my mother sent one text message. We think it's best if you take some space from the family until you're ready to be reasonable. I did not receive another call, text, holiday invitation, or birthday acknowledgement from my mother or my brother for the next 2 years and 4 months. I was 27 years old, widowed, disowned, and sitting on a $6.8 million a year industrial supply company that I had never planned to run alone. If any part of this is sounding familiar to you, I want you to comment below and tell me which part hit closest to home. I read every single one of these. In the weeks after that dinner, the person who caught me wasn't blood. It was Rosa Delgado, Ethan's aunt, the same woman who'd baked our wedding cake 6 years earlier. Rosa was 61, twice widowed herself, and had run a small bookkeeping firm in Poughkeepsie for over 2 decades before retiring. She showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening in June 2019 with a casserole dish and a legal pad, sat at my kitchen counter, and said, Okay, show me the books. Not because I don't trust you know what you're doing. Because you shouldn't have to carry this alone, and I have 30 years of knowing exactly what questions to ask a supplier who's trying to squeeze you. Rosa became, over the following months, the closest thing I had to a mother in the truest sense of the word, not biologically, but in every way that mattered. She sat with me on nights when the grief hit sideways, and I couldn't remember why I was standing in the middle of my own kitchen. She reviewed contracts with me line by line. She was the one who, in August 2019, looked at a proposed vendor agreement I was about to sign and said, Absolutely not. This clause lets them walk away from a shipment penalty-free. Redline it. And she was right, and it saved the company an estimated $180,000 over the following 18 months. She never once asked me for anything in return. She used to say, "Ethan would have wanted somebody watching your back. I'm just doing the job." By the end of 2019, Reyes Precision Supply had grown to $7.3 million in annual revenue under my leadership, and I had hired our first full-time operations manager, a sharp 29-year-old named Devin Okafor, who'd previously worked logistics for a much larger aerospace parts firm in Albany. I was building something. Slowly, painfully, some days by pure force of will alone, but I was building it. My family, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. No calls on my birthday that October. No acknowledgement of the one-year anniversary of Ethan's death that February. I heard through a cousin, secondhand, that my mother had told people at church that I had cut off the family over money, which was such a complete inversion of what actually happened that the first time I heard it, I laughed out loud, alone in my car in a grocery store parking lot at 6:40 p.m. on a Thursday in March 2020. I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel is about truth, not performance. There were nights in that first year where the silence from my family hurt more than Ethan's death did, in a strange, twisted way, because Ethan's absence was a wound I understood. My family's absence felt like a verdict, like 34 years of being someone's daughter had been quietly reclassified as a mistake they were correcting. But I didn't fall apart. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you expect this part of the story to be about crying in the dark, and it wasn't, not mostly. It was about spreadsheets at midnight. It was about Rosa's casserole dishes and her red pen. It was about Devin and me driving 4 hours to Erie, Pennsylvania in January 2020 to personally save a contract with a client who was ready to walk, and getting it done, and driving home at 1 a.m. eating gas station coffee and laughing for the first time in almost a year. By the spring of 2020, as the world outside was falling into chaos with the pandemic, Reyes Precision Supply, because we serviced aerospace and defense subcontractors, an industry that never fully stopped, actually grew. We ended 2020 at $8.1 million in revenue. I signed my first seven-figure single contract that October, a 3-year supply agreement worth $2.4 million with a subcontractor outside Syracuse. I remember standing in the empty warehouse late one night that winter, the overhead fluorescents humming, the smell of machine oil and cardboard still lingering from the day's shipments, and thinking, nobody in my family knows this is happening. Nobody knows what this company has become. And for the first time since May 2019, that thought didn't feel like grief. It felt like the beginning of something else entirely. I didn't know yet how long the silence would last, or what would eventually break it. I didn't know that 3 years later, my own brother would try to sell something that was never his to sell. All I knew, standing in that warehouse at 34 years old going on 28, was that I had survived the worst year of my life without a single person from my childhood reaching out to ask if I was okay, and somehow I was still standing. That was only the beginning of the years I spent building this alone. What came next changed everything. Year 1 of the silence taught me how to run a company on 4 hours of sleep. Year 2 taught me how to run one without flinching every time the phone rang, and it wasn't my mother. By the start of 2021, Reyes Precision Supply had moved into a larger facility, a 9,000 square foot warehouse and office space just outside Kingston on Route 32, with a loading dock big enough to run 2 trucks simultaneously for the first time in the company's history. I remember standing in that empty building in January, before we'd moved a single pallet in, and thinking about how Ethan used to talk about, someday we'll need more square footage, like it was a fantasy he wasn't sure he'd live to see. I signed the lease alone for $14,200 a month, and I didn't cry doing it. I just felt him there. Somehow, in the particular way grief settles into something quieter after enough time passes. Rosa was the one who suggested the binder. It started small, just a plain black 3-ring binder she picked up at a Staples in Poughkeepsie for $6.99, the kind with a clear plastic sleeve on the front. Every contract, every wire transfer, every email that matters, print it and put it in here, she told me one night in March 2021, sitting at my kitchen counter with her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair. Not because you think you'll need it, because someday you might, and you won't remember why unless it's in front of you in black and white. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I thought it was just Rosa being Rosa, meticulous to a fault, the same instinct that made her balance her own checkbook to the penny well into her 60s, even though she had online banking. But I started the binder anyway, because she'd been right about almost everything else. By the end of 2021, it held 340 pages. By the end of 2022, it had become 3 binders, color-coded, contracts in black, financials in navy, and a slim red one that just held printouts of every single piece of communication, or lack thereof, from my family. That red binder had exactly 4 items in it after 2.5 years. My mother's one-line text from May 2019, a returned birthday card I'd sent Gran in 2020 that came back unopened with return to sender written in handwriting that wasn't the postal services, a screenshot of a mutual cousin's Facebook comment mentioning that Grant's business is really struggling since the fastening name lost that Buffalo contract, and in December 2021, a single Christmas card from my mother with no note inside, just a printed Hallmark verse and her signature. No mention of Ethan. No mention of a 2.5 years of nothing. Just a card, like a formality being fulfilled rather than a bridge being rebuilt. I kept that card. I don't fully know why. Rosa said, "Put it in the binder." And so I did. Work, in the meantime, had become the place where I felt most like myself. In April 2021, I was named to the Hudson Valley Business Journal's 40 Under 40 list, a small regional honor that meant almost nothing outside a 60-mile radius, but meant everything to me personally, because it was the first time my name had appeared anywhere as Mia Reyes, CEO, rather than as someone's widow or someone's daughter. Devin Okafor, who I'd promoted to Vice President of Operations that same year with a salary bump to $118,000, framed the article and hung it in the break room without telling me, and I found it there on a Tuesday morning in May, and I had to go sit in my car for 10 minutes before I could walk back inside. By the end of 2021, Reyes Precision Supply closed the year at $9.6 million in revenue, and I signed our largest single contract to date that November, a 4-year, $5.1 million supply agreement with a defense subcontractor in Utica that Devin and I had been courting for 14 months. I remember the exact moment the signed contract came back over email, 4:47 p.m. on November 9th, 2021. I printed it, put it in the black binder, and then I drove to Rosa's house and we split a bottle of Malbec at her kitchen table and she said, "Ethan would be so unbelievably proud of you and so annoyed that he's not here to say it himself." And we both laughed until we were both, somehow, also crying a little, and it was the good kind. Year 2 rolled into year 3 the way silence always does when you stop actively waiting for it to break. It stops feeling like an open wound and starts feeling like weather, just a condition you live inside. I turned 30 in October 2021. Nobody in my biological family called. I spent the evening at Rosa's with Devin and his wife, eating homemade tamales Rosa had spent all day making, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the best birthdays of my life. Meanwhile, word started reaching me, the way it always does in small towns, through cousins and old classmates, and the occasional too-friendly message from someone I hadn't spoken to since high school that Callaway Fastening Solutions was not doing well. Grant had lost the company's largest client, a manufacturing firm in Buffalo that had represented nearly 30% of Callaway's revenue, sometime in early 2022, reportedly over a series of missed delivery windows and a pricing dispute Grant had mishandled. My mother, according to my cousin Priya, who I stayed loosely in touch with, had started helping out at the office 3 days a week, which Priya said with a specific tone that told me exactly how well that was going. I felt something when I heard that news, and I want to be honest about what it was, because I think it's more complicated than triumph. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was something closer to a quiet, sad recognition, the confirmation of something I'd suspected for years, which was that Grant had never actually been groomed to run a business. He'd simply been anointed to run one, and those are not the same thing. And my father's death hadn't given him competence. It had only given him a title. I didn't reach out. I want to be clear about that. Some of you watching this might wonder why I didn't extend an olive branch when I heard the company was struggling. The truth is, I had extended one already, back in 2019, in the form of a decision that simply asked to be respected. Nobody had wanted the olive branch. They'd wanted the business. Those aren't the same offer, and I wasn't going to pretend they were just because circumstances had shifted 3 years later. By mid-2022, Reyes Precision Supply had grown enough that I made the decision to formally restructure. On June 14, 2022, I incorporated a parent holding entity, M. Callaway Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, with Reyes Precision Supply operating as its primary subsidiary. I chose that name deliberately. Callaway was my maiden name. It was the name of the family that had made it clear I wasn't welcome at their table anymore, and I took it back for myself, on my own terms, attached to something I had built with my own hands rather than something I had been handed. My attorney at the time, a sharp corporate lawyer named Deborah, Sue, who I'd retained out of a firm in Albany, asked me why I wanted the holding company structured that way, with a name that wasn't obviously Mia Reyes or Reyes Precision on any public filing. I told her, honestly, because someday I might need to buy something or bid on something, and I don't want my last name walking into the room 3 steps ahead of me. She didn't ask any follow-up questions. She just nodded and said, "That's smart estate and acquisition planning regardless of the reason," and drew up the paperwork. I didn't know yet how prophetic that decision would turn out to be. I just knew, on some level I couldn't fully articulate at the time, that I wanted a version of myself that existed at arm's length from the Callaway name whenever it suited me, and close to it whenever it didn't. If you've ever built something specifically so that the people who doubted you would eventually have to reckon with it, even if they never knew it was you, tell me in the comments. I have a feeling I'm not the only one. 2022 closed with Reyes Precision Supply at $11.4 million in annual revenue, a headcount of 34 employees, and a new 3-year contract renewal with our original Utica client that improved margins. I bought my first house that September, a 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Lane in Kingston for $612,000, paid with a 30% down payment I'd saved from 4 years of reinvesting almost nothing into my personal life and almost everything into the business, and a modest but real personal salary. I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys, October 3, 2022, and thinking about how Ethan and I used to sit in our cramped rental apartment in Kingston and sketch out, on the backs of napkins, what a someday house might look like. I'd built the someday. He wasn't there to see it. That particular kind of grief never fully leaves. It just learns to sit quietly in a corner of a room you're otherwise happy to be standing in. The first real crack in the silence came in March 2023, almost 4 years to the month since that dinner at my mother's kitchen table. It wasn't a call. It was a text message out of nowhere from Grant's wife Kayla, who I hadn't heard from directly in the entire 4 years. "Hey Mia, hope you're doing okay. Saw the Hudson Valley Business Journal thing about you a while back. That's really impressive. Hope we can catch up sometime." I stared at that text for almost 20 minutes before I responded, and when I did, I kept it simple. "Thanks, Kayla. Hope you guys are well too." Nothing more. I put a screenshot of it in the red binder that night, and Rosa, when I showed her, just raised an eyebrow and said, "That's not concern, sweetheart. That's reconnaissance. Mark my words." I told her I thought she was being cynical. She said, "I've been divorced twice and buried one husband, and I've never once had someone reach out 4 years into total silence just because they saw an article. You watch. This is the opening of a door, and it's not opening because they missed you." I didn't fully believe her at the time. Some small part of me, the part that was still 9 years old and wanted my mother to be proud of me, wanted to believe that maybe, finally, enough time had passed that people were softening, that maybe grief and stubbornness were finally giving way to something more like family. I told myself that possibility was worth holding on to, even carefully, even at arm's length. But 2023 kept moving, and Reyes Precision Supply kept growing, and the silence from everyone except that one text from Kayla continued unbroken through the spring and into the summer. We closed a $3.8 million contract with a new aerospace client out of Rochester in July 2023. I hired our first chief financial officer, a meticulous 45-year-old named Warren Iyer, who came from a much larger regional manufacturing firm, at a salary of $165,000, specifically because I wanted institutional-grade financial oversight as the company kept scaling past what I could track entirely in my own head, binder system or not. By October 2023, on the 4-year anniversary of Ethan's death, Reyes Precision Supply had grown to a company doing just over $13 million in annual revenue, servicing 11 active clients across defense, aerospace, and precision manufacturing sectors in 4 states. That same month, something happened that none of us saw coming, least of all me. A regional business publication called Empire State Manufacturing Quarterly, doing a feature on women rebuilding family legacies in industrial supply, reached out to interview me. I almost said no. I've never loved being in front of a camera or having my name attached to a headline. But Rosa convinced me it might be good for the company's visibility with larger institutional clients, and Devin agreed. And so, on a cold Tuesday morning in late October 2023, a reporter and a photographer came to the Kingston warehouse and spent 4 hours with me, walking the floor, photographing me in front of the loading dock with my arms crossed, asking about growth numbers I was, for the first time in years, proud enough to say out loud. The article ran in December 2023, under the headline From Widow to $13 Million CEO, How Mia Reyes Rebuilt a Company Twice, complete with a large photo of me standing in front of the Reyes Precision Supply sign, and a smaller sidebar noting my maiden name, Callaway, and a brief, factual mention that my late father had run a separate, unrelated family business in the same region. I didn't think much of that sidebar detail when I approved the final draft. It felt like a footnote. I had no idea, that December, sitting in my office reviewing the proof copy with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, that somewhere in Marsden Falls, someone was going to read that same article, see that same photograph, do that same math about the Callaway name, and start making calls. I didn't know it yet, but the 4 years and 7 months of silence were about to end, and not because anyone had missed me. Let me back up, though, because I don't want to give you the impression that those 4 years were a straight, tidy climb. They weren't. There were whole stretches where the company felt like the only stable thing in my life, and everything else felt like it was being held together with tape. Year 1, 2019 into 2020, was mostly survival. I made mistakes that first year that still make me wince a little. I underpriced a contract with a client in Scranton so badly, in September 2019, that we lost roughly $22,000 in projected margin over the 18-month term before Devin caught the error during a routine quarterly review, and we renegotiated the terms at the first available break clause. I didn't sleep the night we found that mistake. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m. with a calculator and a legal pad, convinced I was going to run Ethan's company into the ground within a year and prove every single thing my mother had implied about me being unready. Rosa came over the next morning with coffee and told me, very plainly, every single business owner I have ever worked with in 30 years has made an expensive mistake in their first 18 months. The only difference between the ones who make it and the ones who don't is whether they let one mistake convince them they're a fraud. You are not a fraud, Mia. You caught it. You fixed it. That's the whole job. I held on to that sentence for years afterward, on nights when the doubt crept back in. Year 2, 2020 into 2021, was when things started to genuinely stabilize, helped in no small part by the fact that our sector, aerospace and defense-adjacent manufacturing, proved to be far more insulated from the broader pandemic shutdowns than almost any other industry I knew of. While friends of mine were furloughing staff or shuttering storefronts entirely, we were fielding more inbound requests than we had capacity to service, because our clients' were, in many cases, government-adjacent and operating under essential business designations. It felt strange, honestly, to be growing during a year when so much of the world felt like it was falling apart. I remember saying to Devin, in the parking lot outside the warehouse one evening in August 2020, both of us in masks, both of us exhausted, I don't know whether to feel grateful or guilty, and Devin, who has always had a gift for cutting through my overthinking, said, feel grateful. Guilt doesn't pay anyone's mortgage. Gratitude, plus doing right by your people, does. I gave every employee a $1,500 hazard bonus that December, on top of standard year-end pay, and I never once regretted the dent it put in our margins. The documentation habit Rosa had instilled kept expanding in ways I hadn't anticipated either. By 2021, it wasn't just contracts and financials. It became a running record of every promise made to a client, every verbal agreement later confirmed in writing, every vendor negotiation. When a supplier out of Erie tried, in March 2022, to claim we'd verbally agreed to a price increase we'd never actually agreed to, I was able to pull the entire email thread from the binder system within 4 minutes during the call, read back the actual agreed terms line by line, and end the dispute before it became expensive. Warren, once he came on board as CFO in 2023, actually digitized the entire system into a shared drive, though I kept the physical binders too, out of habit, out of something closer to sentiment. Rosa used to joke that the binders were cheaper than therapy and twice as useful in a negotiation, and she wasn't entirely wrong. There were other small, cold contacts from my family sprinkled through those years, beyond just the Christmas card and Kayla's 2023 text, moments that kept the silence from feeling fully dead, even if they didn't feel like real reconciliation either. In June 2020, I received a mass-forwarded email, clearly not written specifically to me, inviting family and friends to a fundraiser Grant was hosting for the local youth football league, my name still apparently sitting somewhere on an old contact list nobody had bothered to remove. I didn't respond. In February 2022, a mutual cousin, Priya, mentioned during a rare phone call that my mother had asked, seemingly out of nowhere, whether Mia was doing all right, business-wise, a question Priya found strange enough to actually repeat to me verbatim. I remember sitting with that one for days, turning it over, trying to decide if it meant anything. Rosa's read on it was simple. That's not a mother asking about her daughter's well-being. That's a mother doing quiet reconnaissance through a cousin because she's too proud to call you directly. File it away. I filed it away, literally, into the red binder, dated and noted. By the time that Empire State Manufacturing quarterly piece was in production in the fall of 2023, I'd stopped actively expecting anything from my family at all, which felt, strangely, like a kind of peace rather than a kind of loss. I had Rosa. I had Devin and his wife, Amara, who'd become close friends over the years, close enough that I was godmother to their daughter, born in March 2022. I had Warren, methodical and dry-humored, who'd become an unexpected source of stability in the office. I had built, without ever intending to build it as a replacement for anything, a family that showed up. So when that magazine article ran in December 2023, and my mother's name never crossed my mind, even once during the entire process, it wasn't bitterness. It was simply that she'd stopped being a variable in my daily calculations a long time before that. I should also tell you about Warren, because he matters later in ways I couldn't have predicted when I hired him. Warren Iyer had spent almost 18 years as a controller and later CFO for a manufacturing conglomerate out of Syracuse before a corporate restructuring eliminated his position in early 2023. I met him through a referral from Deborah Sue, my attorney, who described him as the most conservative, risk-averse financial mind I know, which is exactly what a company growing this fast actually needs. Warren's first act as CFO, in April 2023, was to sit me down and walk through every single contract in the black binder, cross-referencing them against our actual cash flow, and flag 2 clients whose payment terms had quietly slipped from net 30 to something closer to net 75 without anyone formally renegotiating anything. It saved us, by his own conservative estimate, somewhere around $340,000 in working capital exposure over the following year, simply by catching it early and renegotiating terms before it became a real liquidity problem. Warren was also the one who first suggested, in August 2023, that I consider formal succession in estate planning documents given the size the company had grown to, a suggestion that felt almost absurd to me at 31 years old, but one I took seriously anyway because Ethan's death had taught me, more than anything else in my life, that nobody is ever quite as young as they think they are when it comes to being prepared. I met with Deborah that September and drafted a revised will and a set of governance documents for M. Callaway Holdings that named Rosa and Devin as co-executors should anything ever happen to me. I remember sitting in Deborah's office signing those papers and thinking about how strange it was that the people legally entrusted with my life's work were an aunt by marriage and an operations manager I'd hired off a cold job posting, rather than anyone who shared my blood. I don't say that with bitterness, for what it's worth. I say it because it's simply what was true, and by that point in my life, truth had become something I trusted a great deal more than sentiment. The Empire State Manufacturing quarterly interview itself was, honestly, a strange experience to sit through. The reporter, a woman named Claire Ostrowski, asked me at one point, almost offhandedly, whether my family had been supportive when I first took over the company after my husband's death. I remember pausing for what felt like a very long time before answering, choosing my words carefully. I had incredible support from my late husband's family, I said. That's really who got me through those first years. It was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. And Claire, to her credit, didn't push further, though I noticed her jot something down on her notepad that I couldn't quite read from where I was sitting. The photographer, a younger guy named Marcus, spent almost 40 minutes trying to get one specific shot he wanted, me standing at the far end of the warehouse, arms crossed, with the entire length of the loading dock and both delivery trucks visible behind me, natural light coming through the bay doors at a low afternoon angle. When the article finally ran 2 months later, that was the photo they chose for the cover, and it was, I'll admit, a good one. I looked exactly like what I had actually become, whether I fully recognized her yet or not. Someone who had built something real, entirely on her own terms, out of grief and stubbornness and 4 years of nobody checking in. By the time December 2023 arrived, Reyes Precision Supply, under the M. Callaway Holdings umbrella, was doing just over $13 million a year, employing 34 people across our Kingston headquarters and a smaller satellite office we'd opened in Utica that spring to be closer to our largest client. I was, by any reasonable external measure, exactly where I'd once dreamed Ethan and I might be someday if we'd had another 20 years together instead of 6. Which is exactly why what happened next caught me as off guard as it did. The call came on January 11th, 2024, at 6:14 p.m., while I was still at the office finishing a vendor review with Warren. My phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in almost 5 years, and for a full 3 rings I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen, before I finally answered. Mia! My mother's voice, unmistakable even after all that time, softer than I remembered it, almost tentative. It's Mom. I saw the article. Claire Ostrowski's piece. I didn't know, sweetheart. I had no idea things had gotten this big. I sat very still at my desk. Warren, across the room, glanced up at me once, and then quietly gathered his folders and stepped out, giving me privacy without needing to be asked. Things have been growing for a while, Mom, I said, keeping my voice level. 5 years, actually. There was a pause. I know it's been a long time. I've thought about calling so many times. Pride is a stupid thing, Mia. I let pride get in the way for too long, and I'm sorry. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't even really anger. It was something closer to a very old, very familiar ache, the same one I used to feel as a kid watching everyone light up for Grant's touchdown while I sat quietly in the bleachers with a debate trophy nobody asked to see. Some small part of me, even at 32, even after everything, wanted this call to be real. Wanted, badly, for 5 years of silence to be washed away by one sincere apology. I appreciate you calling, I said carefully. It's been a long time. Can we see you? Grant and I would love to take you to dinner. Catch up properly. I want to hear everything about the company, about how you've been. I agreed. Mostly, I think, because some wounded part of me needed to know whether this was real. We set a date, January 27th, 2024, at a mid-range steakhouse in Kingston called the Ridgeline, a place I'd chosen specifically because it was public, comfortable, and gave me an easy exit if I needed one. That night, over dinner, my mother and Grant were, on the surface, warm in a way I hadn't experienced from either of them in years. Grant asked genuinely engaged questions about our contract structure, about margins, about how I'd scaled the operations team. My mother reached across the table at one point and squeezed my hand and said, I am so proud of you, Mia. I should have said that a long time ago. I let myself believe it, mostly that night. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in years, a loosening in my chest, a cautious, fragile hope that maybe this could actually be repaired. If you've ever wanted so badly to believe an apology was real that you talked yourself out of your own instincts, comment below, because this is the part of the story where I need you to understand I'm not naive. I was just human. Over the following 6 weeks, the contact continued. Grant texted a few times, nothing heavy, just casual check-ins, a photo of his 2 kids at a school event, a joke about a Marsden Falls diner closing down. My mother called every Sunday, like clockwork, always asking a version of the same questions. How was the Rochester contract going? Had we expanded the Utica office yet? Was I looking at any acquisitions? I noted, somewhere in the back of my mind, How many of those questions circled specifically around size and value and expansion rather than anything resembling my actual life? How I was sleeping, whether I was dating again, whether I still missed Ethan on the anniversary. But I told myself grief made people awkward, that maybe business was simply the safest language my mother had for reconnecting with me after so long. The moment everything shifted happened on March 2nd, 2024, almost entirely by accident. Grant had come to Kingston that weekend, ostensibly to see my new house on Birchwood Lane for the first time. "Just to see where you landed," he'd said over text. We had a pleasant enough afternoon. He admired the kitchen renovation I'd done in 2023, asked detailed questions about the property taxes, asked, almost in passing, what the house had appraised for. I told him, not thinking much of it, $780,000, up from the $612,000 I'd paid 18 months earlier. At one point, while I was in the kitchen refilling our coffee, Grant's phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter where he'd left it, a string of notifications lighting up the screen. I wasn't trying to look. I want to be clear about that. But the phone was face up, 6 inches from where I was standing, and the messages were from a group chat labeled Family, Fastening, and the preview text, 3 messages deep, was impossible not to see. The first, from my mother. "Did you get a number on the house yet?" The second, from Grant, sent apparently just minutes before he'd arrived at my door. $780K on the house alone, and that's before the company valuation. If we can get her to even consider a partnership stake in Fastening, or better yet a buyout of the Buffalo debt, we're solved. The third, from a name I didn't immediately recognize. I'd later learn it was Grant's business partner and Callaway Fastening's minority shareholder, a man named Curtis Vance, read simply, "She still doesn't know about the loan default deadline?" I stood in my own kitchen, coffee pot in hand, and read those 3 messages twice to make absolutely sure I wasn't misreading them. Then I set the coffee pot down, very calmly, walked back into the living room, and continued the conversation with Grant as though nothing had happened, because I needed time to think before I let anyone know what I'd seen. That night, after Grant left, I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 1 a.m. with Rosa on speakerphone, reading her the messages word for word from memory while she listened in absolute silence. "There it is," she finally said. "I told you 4 years ago, and I'll tell you again. That family didn't come back for you. They came back for the balance sheet." The next morning, I called Deborah Sue and asked for an emergency consultation. Over the following 2 weeks, Deborah and Warren worked together to help me understand exactly what I was dealing with. What we uncovered was worse than I'd expected. Callaway Fastening Solutions, under Grant's leadership, had taken out a $1.4 million commercial loan in 2022 to cover expansion costs after losing the Buffalo account, using the company's real estate and remaining equipment as collateral. By late 2023, after another rocky year, they were in default on that loan, with a foreclosure deadline set for June 30th, 2024. My mother, according to property records Deborah pulled, had also taken out a second mortgage on her own house in late 2023, co-signed by Grant, presumably to try to keep the company afloat, and that, too, was now underwater. The reconnection, the warm dinner, the Sunday calls, Grant's visit to see the house, all of it, every piece had been reconnaissance. They needed to know exactly what I was worth, exactly how liquid I was, and exactly how emotionally reachable I still might be, before they made whatever ask they were building toward. I felt something crack open in me reading through Deborah's summary of the loan documents. Not sadness exactly, and not even really surprise, because some quiet, guarded part of me had suspected precisely this the moment my mother's number lit up my phone in January. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of grim clarity. The kind that comes when a suspicion you've been trying hard not to believe turns out to be precisely true. "What do you want to do?" Deborah asked me. In her office on March 19, 2024, the loan documents spread across the table between us. I told her the truth. I want to know everything about that loan and that property before anyone asks me for a single dollar. I want to understand exactly what leverage exists, and I want to know if there's a way to be in a position of strength before this conversation happens, instead of finding out about it during an ambush at a dinner table, the way I found out about everything else in this family. Deborah smiled just slightly. "That's the right instinct. Let's build you that position." Over the following month, Deborah and Warren helped me quietly research the foreclosure timeline, the actual market value of the Callaway fastening property and equipment, and, critically, whether the defaulted loan or the underlying property might, at some point, become available for acquisition through the bank rather than through my family directly. I didn't tell Grant or my mother any of this. I let the Sunday calls continue. I let Grant's occasional check-in texts continue. I played, I suppose you could say, exactly the same quiet, patient game they've been playing with me, except I had something they didn't. I actually understood how businesses and banks and distressed assets worked because I'd spent 5 years building one from nothing while they'd spent 5 years coasting on inherited momentum. The ask finally came on April 14th, 2024, over Easter dinner at my mother's house, the first time I'd been back inside that kitchen since the night I was disowned there 5 years earlier. I sat at that same table, in nearly the same chair, and let my mother pour me a glass of wine and waited. Grant broached it about 40 minutes in, his voice carefully casual, the way you'd bring up something you'd rehearsed. Mia, I know this might be a lot to ask, but the company's going through a rough patch. Nothing we can't handle long-term, but there's a loan situation that's gotten a little tighter than we'd like. I was wondering if you'd ever consider coming in as an investor. Not even a majority stake, just enough to help us clear the immediate pressure. It would mean a lot, honestly. It would keep the business, keep Dad's legacy in the family. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at my mother, who was watching me with an expression I recognized instantly because I'd seen its opposite 5 years earlier. Not disappointment this time, but hope, calculated and careful, the kind of hope that only shows up when someone needs something from you. How much are we talking about? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even. Realistically, to clear the loan and stabilize things properly, somewhere around $1.4 million, Grant said. I nodded slowly, as though considering it seriously for the first time, giving away nothing about the 4 weeks of quiet research already sitting in a folder on Warren's desk. I'll think about it, I said. This is a big decision. I need time. I watched something in my mother's shoulders relax, just slightly, as though she believed the door had cracked open exactly as wide as she needed it to. She had no idea it had already closed. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days before that Easter dinner, on April 11th, 2024, Deborah had confirmed through a contact at the lending bank that Callaway Fastening's loan was, in fact, headed toward a bank-initiated liquidation sale rather than a private renegotiation, given how far past the cure period the default had gone. The property, the equipment, and the underlying business assets were going to be sold, one way or another, by early summer. The only real question left was who would be sitting on the other side of that sale. I drove home from that Easter dinner in near total silence, the folder of research sitting untouched in my bag, my mother's hopeful, calculating expression still fixed in my mind. Somewhere between Marsden Falls and Kingston, on that quiet 40-minute drive, I made a decision I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider until that exact moment. I called Deborah the next morning, April 15th, 2024, and said 6 words that set everything else in motion. I want to bid on it myself. Deborah didn't even hesitate. I was wondering when you'd say that. But before I explain how that bid actually came together, I need to back up and tell you about the weeks between the phone messages I saw on Grant's counter and that Easter dinner, because a lot happened in that window that shaped everything that came after, and I don't want to skip past how carefully I had to move. The morning after I read those texts on Grant's phone, I did something I'm not entirely proud of, though I've made peace with it since. I didn't confront him. I didn't call my mother and demand an explanation. Instead, I went to the office, sat down with Warren, and asked him to quietly pull together a full financial profile on Callaway Fastening Solutions using every public record available, county tax filings, UCC lien filings, any court dockets, anything that existed in the public domain. Warren, methodical as always, didn't ask why. He simply said, "Give me a week," and got to work. What came back, over the following 10 days, painted a picture far more precise than the fragments I'd overheard. Callaway Fastening had lost not just the Buffalo account in early 2022, but 2 smaller regional clients over the following 18 months, largely, according to a county court filing from a vendor dispute, due to repeated late deliveries and quality control issues that had never existed under my father's leadership. Revenue, had fallen from a peak of roughly $4.6 million in 2018, the year before my father died, to just $2.1 million by the end of 2023. The $1.4 million loan Grant had taken out in 2022 had been secured against the Marsden Falls property itself, the same building my father had operated out of for over 20 years, as well as the manufacturing equipment inside it. My mother's second mortgage, taken out in November 2023, added another layer of personal exposure, meaning that if the business loan went into full liquidation, she stood to lose significant equity in her own home as well. I sat with that information for several days before I told anyone besides Rosa and Deborah. I remember sitting on my back porch on Birchwood Lane one evening in mid-March, the air still sharp with late winter cold, turning the whole situation over in my mind. Part of me, I'll admit, felt a flicker of something almost like vindication, a quiet, unspoken confirmation that the version of competence my family had always assumed belonged naturally to Grant had never actually been real. It had simply never been tested until my father wasn't there to cover for it. But a much larger part of me felt something heavier, a strange, complicated grief for the version of my father's legacy that was now genuinely at risk of disappearing entirely, sold off in pieces to satisfy a bank, regardless of what happened between me and my family. Rosa, when I told her the full picture, was characteristically blunt. You are allowed to feel two things at once, sweetheart. You're allowed to feel for your father's legacy, and still refuse to hand your own hard-earned money to people who only remembered you existed once they needed something from you. Those aren't contradictions. That's just being a whole person. It was Rosa, actually, who first floated the idea that eventually became the entire strategy. We were sitting at her kitchen table on March 24th, 2024, going through the numbers Warren had compiled, when she said, almost offhandedly, "If that property's really headed toward a bank sale regardless of what your mother does, somebody's going to end up owning it. Why does that somebody have to be a stranger? Or worse, have to be Grant limping along with more debt? Why can't that somebody be you on your own terms, with your own name nowhere near the transaction until you decide it should be?" I remember staring at her for a long moment before I fully understood what she was suggesting. That conversation was what sent me to Deborah's office the following week, not yet to make a final decision, but to understand whether it was even legally and financially feasible. Deborah walked me through the mechanics carefully. If Callaway Fastening did default fully, and the lending bank moved to liquidate, the property and business assets would likely go to a receiver or be listed through a commercial broker for sale, potentially at a meaningful discount to true market value given the circumstances. If Callaway Holdings, my holding company, the one bearing my maiden name but with no obvious public link back to me personally in casual searches, submitted a bid through that process, there was no legal requirement that Grant or my mother be informed of the buyer's identity before closing, provided the transaction was structured as a standard asset purchase rather than a negotiated private sale between known parties. You would need to be prepared for them to eventually find out, Deborah warned me. Public deed transfers aren't secret forever. But you could absolutely control the timeline of when that happens, and more importantly, you'd control the terms. I sat with that for nearly 2 weeks before Easter, running the numbers with Warren, stress testing whether Reyes Precision Supply could actually absorb a $1.4 million acquisition without jeopardizing our own operations. Warren's answer, delivered with his usual careful precision on April 8, 2024, was cautiously affirmative. It's tight, but with our current cash reserves and the Rochester contract closing next quarter, we can structure this without taking on new debt, provided we're disciplined about integration costs afterward. That was the confirmation I needed. So when I sat across from Grant and my mother at that Easter table 9 days later, listening to Grant frame the ask as though it were a spontaneous, humble request between siblings, I already knew almost everything about the loan, the deadline, the appraised value of the property, and the timeline the bank was working with. I said very little that night beyond, "I need time to think about it," because I genuinely did need time, not to decide whether to help them the way they were asking, but to finalize exactly how I intended to move instead. The bid closed on June 12, 2024. Callaway Holdings LLC became the legal owner of the Marsden Falls property, the manufacturing equipment inside it, and the remaining inventory of what had once been Callaway Fastening Solutions, for a final purchase price of $1.55 million, transferred through the receiver's broker with no public announcement and no press release of any kind. Deborah handled the closing remotely. I never once had to be in the same room as anyone involved in the sale on the other side. For nearly 3 weeks, my name existed nowhere near that transaction in any way my family would have thought to look. I want to be honest about how I felt in the days right after the closing, because it wasn't simple. I drove past the Marsden Falls building once, on June 15th, on my way to visit an old family friend a few towns over, and I sat in my car in the parking lot across the street for almost 20 minutes, looking at the faded Callaway Fastening Solutions sign my father had put up in 1994, still bolted above the front entrance, paint peeling at the corners. I felt grief for him in a way I hadn't expected. I felt something close to satisfaction, too, and I let myself sit with both of those feelings without trying to talk myself out of either one. What I didn't yet know was exactly when, or how, my family would find out. Deborah had warned me the deed transfer would eventually become part of the public county record, and it did, filed on June 18, 2024, quietly logged into the Marsden Falls County Clerk's database along with thousands of other unremarkable filings that week. It was Curtis Vance, Grant's minority business partner, who found it. According to what I later pieced together, Curtis had been checking the county records obsessively in the weeks after the loan default, anxious about what might happen to his own minority stake in the business once the property changed hands. On June 24, 2024, he pulled the deed record himself, saw the name M. Callaway Holdings LLC listed as the new owner, and, because Curtis had grown up 2 towns over from Marsden Falls and had known our family peripherally for years, put the pieces together almost immediately. He called Grant that same evening. I found out how that call went only much later, from Grant himself, in a moment I'll get to. But I do know that within 18 hours of Curtis's discovery, my mother had called me 4 times in a row, each call going straight to voicemail because I happened to be in back-to-back meetings that entire day. By the 5th call, on the evening of June 25, 2024, she left a voicemail, her voice shaking in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before, not even at Ethan's funeral. "Mia, I need you to call me back the second you get this. There's something going on with the building, with the property, and I need to understand what's happening. Please call me back." I listened to that voicemail standing in my own kitchen, the same kitchen where Rosa had first suggested the binder 5 years earlier, the same kitchen where I'd read those 3 text messages on Grant's phone just months before. I didn't call back that night. I wanted one more evening of clarity before everything that came next. The following morning, June 26, 2024, my mother texted me, "Grant is driving to your house right now. We need to talk. Please be home." I looked at that message for a long time. Then I walked into my home office, opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled out the black binder, the original one, the very first one Rosa had bought at that Staples in Poughkeepsie for $6.99, along with a folder Deborah had prepared weeks earlier, the closing documents from the sale, printed and organized, ready for exactly this moment. I set both on my kitchen table, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down to wait. 20 minutes later, I heard tires on my gravel driveway, and through the front window I watched Grant's car pull in behind my mother's, both of them arriving within moments of each other, exactly as if they'd coordinated the drive over on the phone the entire way. I watched my mother get out first, her hand already pressed flat against her chest the way it always went when she was bracing herself for something. Grant followed a few steps behind her, his jaw tight, his eyes already fixed on my front door. I didn't move to greet them. I sat where I was, the binder closed in front of me, the closing documents squared neatly beside it, and I let them ring the doorbell. I opened the door before the second ring. My mother stood on the porch first, her face pale, her hands twisting together in front of her the way they used to when I was a kid, and she was bracing to deliver bad news about a relative's health. Grant stood just behind her, arms crossed, jaw set in a way that told me he'd already decided, somewhere on the drive over, that anger was going to be his opening move. "Mia," my mother said, her voice tight, "we need to talk. Right now." "Okay," I said, stepping back to let them in. "Come sit down." I led them into my kitchen, the same room where I'd sat with the binder 20 minutes earlier, and gestured toward the table. My mother said immediately. Grant remained standing near the counter, arms still crossed, his eyes scanning the room the way they had back in March, except this time there was no pretense of admiring a kitchen renovation. "Curtis called me," Grant said, before I'd even sat down myself. "M. Calloway Holdings. That's you, isn't it?" I pulled out my chair and sat, folding my hands calmly on the table in front of me. "Yes," I said. "That's me." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. My mother's face moved through something complicated, confusion, then a flicker of what almost looked like hope, as though some part of her thought this might still resolve in her favor, that maybe I'd bought the property specifically to hand it back to them as a gesture of reconciliation. "So you bought it," she said slowly. "You bought Dad's building. Mia, that's actually wonderful. That means we can still work something out. We can talk about terms about." "There aren't going to be terms, Mom," I said, keeping my voice level, quiet, the way Rosa had taught me years ago that calm carries further than volume ever does in a room where someone is hoping you'll lose control. "I didn't buy that property to give it back to Calloway Fastening Solutions. I bought it because the bank was liquidating it regardless of what happened between us, and I decided I'd rather it belong to me than to a stranger, or to another 5 years of Grant running it the same way he ran it into the ground." Grant's arms unfolded. His voice rose fast. "You had no right to do that behind our backs. That's still Dad's company. You can't just swoop in and—" "I can't," I said, and for the first time in the conversation, something in my voice sharpened, just slightly. "Grant, you took out a $1.4 million loan against a building that was never legally yours alone to leverage that heavily, lost it to default within 18 months, and let Mom co-sign a second mortgage on her own house to try to cover your mistakes. I didn't do anything to this company. I refused to keep rescuing people who only remembered I existed once they needed a check." "That's not fair," my mother said, her voice cracking slightly. "We reached out because we missed you, Mia, not because—" "You reached out 4 days after that magazine article ran," I said, and I reached down and opened the folder Deborah had prepared, sliding a single printed page across the table. A screenshot, time-stamped and dated, of the family group chat message Grant had sent that day in March. $780K on the house alone, and that's before the company valuation. The kitchen went completely still. My mother stared at the paper for a long moment without picking it up, her lips pressed into a thin line. Grant's face, for just a flicker of a second, showed something I hadn't seen from him in years. Not defiance, but genuine, unguarded shame, his eyes dropping to the table, his jaw working like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the shape of it. "I saw that message on your phone in March," I said quietly. "The day you came to see my house. I didn't say anything then, because I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I decided how to respond to it." "Mia, Grant started, then stopped, his hand coming up to rub the back of his neck, a gesture I remembered from when we were kids, and he'd been caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. For just a moment, the anger drained out of him entirely, and what was left looked almost young, almost afraid. "I was scared," he said, quieter now. "The bank was going to take everything. I didn't know how else to fix it. I know how it looks. I know it looks calculated. Some of it was. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it wasn't. But some of it, seeing you doing so well, it also just made me angry, if I'm honest, and I don't know what to do with being angry at my own sister for succeeding when I couldn't." I sat with that for a moment, because it was, at least, more honest than anything either of them had said to me in 5 years. "I believe that's real," I said. "I also believe you built a plan around my money before you ever built a plan around actually talking to me like a person. Both things can be true, Grant." My mother, meanwhile, had gone very quiet, staring at the screenshot on the table, her hands trembling slightly where they rested on either side of it. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its earlier urgency entirely. "I told myself it was different," she said, almost to herself. "I told myself I was reaching out because I was proud of you, and some of that was true too. But I let Grant's plan become the reason I finally picked up the phone, instead of just picking it up because you're my daughter, and I let you go for 5 years over a business decision that was never actually mine to make in the first place." It was the first time, in 5 years, that my mother had come anywhere close to admitting that the choice 5 years ago had been hers, not mine, that I had never actually done anything wrong, I had simply refused to hand over something that was rightfully mine, and she had chosen pride over her own daughter as a consequence. "I need you to hear something," I said, and I looked at both of them, taking my time, because I wanted this part said exactly once and said clearly. "I built everything I have without a single dollar or a single phone call from either of you. I built it through 5 years of grief and mistakes and 4 a.m. spreadsheets, and a woman who isn't even my blood but showed up for me every single time either of you didn't. I don't owe this family a rescue. I never did. Being related to someone isn't a claim on what they build after you let them go." Grant was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, in a voice much smaller than the one he'd walked in with, "What happens to the building now? To the equipment? To Curtis? To the 4 employees who are still there?" That question, more than anything else in the conversation, told me something real about him, that underneath the panic and the calculation, there was still a part of my brother capable of thinking about consequences beyond his own immediate survival. "The building and the equipment belong to M. Callaway Holdings now," I said. "I haven't decided everything yet, but I can tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to hand it back to you to run the same way, with the same outcome, in another 18 months. If there's a version of this where the employees keep their jobs and the building keeps operating under new management, possibly under a restructured deal where you're an employee rather than an owner, I'm willing to consider that. Slowly, on terms I control. Not because you're entitled to it, but because I don't actually want to see Dad's legacy disappear into a bank auction file either." My mother's eyes filled, but she didn't cry the way I might have expected 5 years ago. She simply nodded once and said, "That's more than we deserve right now." "I know that. Maybe," I said, "but it's what I can offer. Not because of guilt. Because I decide who I extend grace to and on what terms. And that's mine to decide now, not something anyone gets to assume." Grant stood there for a long moment, and then, quietly, said something I hadn't expected at all. "For what it's worth, and I know it doesn't undo anything, I am proud of what you built. I was too much of a coward to say that when it might have actually meant something, back before any of this happened. I'm saying it now because it's true, not because I need anything else from you today." I looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation I'd learned, over the past 6 months, to watch for so carefully. I didn't find it, not in that particular sentence. Just something tired and a little bit broken, and, underneath all of it, real. "I hear you," I said. "That matters. It doesn't erase 5 years. But it matters." My mother left first, that afternoon, hugging me at the door in a way that felt, for the first time in half a decade, less like a performance and more like an actual apology her body understood before her pride fully caught up to it. Grant lingered a moment longer, and before he walked out, he said, "Curtis is going to want to talk to you about the minority stake situation. He's not like me. He actually ran the floor operations well, from what I understand. If there's a version of this where he stays on in some capacity, I think that's worth exploring, even without me involved." It was, I think, the most selfless thing my brother had said to me in the entire 34 years I'd known him, recommending someone else's interests over his own. At the exact moment, he had the least reason left to do anything generous at all. I want to go back, though, and tell you a few more details from that afternoon, because there's a piece of it I skipped past too quickly, and I think it matters. After Grant made that comment about Curtis, my mother, who had been quiet by the door for several minutes, said something I wasn't expecting. "Can I ask you something, Mia? And I want an honest answer, not a kind one." I told her she could ask. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Did you buy that building because you wanted to help your father's legacy survive, or because you wanted us to know exactly what it felt like to lose something and have no say in how it happened?" It was, I'll admit, a sharper question than I expected from her, and it deserved a real answer. "Both," I told her. "I won't pretend it was purely generous. There's a part of me that needed you both to understand what it feels like to have something taken out of your hands entirely, the way you took my say out of my hands 5 years ago at that same kitchen table. But it's also true that I couldn't stomach the idea of Dad's building going to some anonymous liquidation buyer who'd stripped the equipment for parts and let 4 employees lose their jobs over decisions they never made. Both of those things live in me at the same time. I'm not going to apologize for either one." My mother nodded slowly, and something in her face settled, as though she'd needed to hear that I wasn't operating purely out of either cruelty or saintliness, but out of something more complicated and, I think, more honest than either. Grant, for his part, asked one more question before he left that day, standing in my doorway with his car keys already in hand. Do you think you'll ever actually trust either of us again? Not the surface version. The real version. I thought about that question seriously before I answered, because I didn't want to give him a comforting lie just to end the conversation on an easier note. I don't know yet, I said. Trust isn't something I can hand back just because a conversation went better than I expected it to. It's going to have to be rebuilt slowly, through a lot of ordinary, unremarkable years where nothing dramatic happens and you just show up anyway, the way Rosa did, the way Devin did, without needing anything from me in return. If that happens, over enough time maybe, I'm not closing the door. I'm just not going to pretend it's already open. He nodded, and for the first time since he'd arrived that day, he looked less like a man managing a crisis and more like someone actually absorbing the weight of what the last 5 years had cost him. The weeks after that conversation were strange in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. I kept waiting for a version of guilt to hit me, the kind you'd expect after essentially outmaneuvering your own family in a distressed asset sale, but it never quite arrived in the form I expected. What arrived instead was a kind of clear-eyed grief for the version of my family that could have existed if any of this had gone differently 5 years earlier, mixed with a genuine, uncomplicated pride in the fact that I hadn't needed them to build any of what I had. Deborah handled the formal restructuring of the Marsden Falls entity over the following month, and by late July 2024, I sat down with Curtis Vance for the first time in person, at a diner in Marsden Falls not far from the old Copper Kettle where I used to bus tables as a teenager. Curtis was younger than I expected, maybe 38, with the careful, exhausted look of someone who'd spent 2 years trying to hold together operations under a leader who didn't understand the floor he was managing. I always thought Grant meant well, Curtis told me over coffee. I just don't think meaning well was ever going to be enough, given what the business actually needed. We spent nearly 3 hours that day working through what a restructured operation could look like, keeping the 4 remaining employees, 2 of whom, it turned out, had worked under my father directly back in the early 2000s and had a kind of loyalty to the physical building itself that went beyond any paycheck. Curtis knew the machinery, the supplier relationships, the handful of remaining regional clients still willing to give the business a second chance if the leadership actually changed. By the time we shook hands outside that diner, I had the outline of a plan that felt less like a rescue and more like an actual rebuild, this time on terms that made sense rather than terms built on inherited assumption. We finalized the new entity, Founders Row Precision, in September 2024, with Curtis as general manager, a 15% minority equity stake for him, and M. Callaway Holdings holding majority ownership as a separate operation entirely from Reyes Precision Supply, run by its own management team rather than folded into what Ethan and I had built. I remember standing outside that building in October 2024, watching a small crew rehang a new sign above the entrance, Founders Row Precision, in simple navy lettering, my father's original building finally getting a second chance under people who actually understood how to run it. I didn't cry, but I stood there for a long time, longer than I needed to, just looking at it. I made one decision during that restructuring that I debated for weeks before finalizing, and I think it's worth mentioning because it says something about where I'd landed by that point. Deborah had drawn up the paperwork with an option for me to install a board seat for myself on Founders Row Precision, given that M. Callaway Holdings held majority ownership. I chose not to take it. I told Deborah, and later told Curtis directly, that I wanted this to be an operation that stood on its own, run by someone who actually understood the floor, rather than something I oversaw personally out of some lingering need to prove a point to my family. Curtis seemed genuinely surprised by that decision. Most owners in your position would want more control, not less, he said. I told him control had never actually been what I wanted out of any of this. What I'd wanted was for the truth of who was capable of what to finally be visible, out in the open, instead of buried under 30 years of assumption about who deserved to lead simply because of when they were born or how they'd been favored as children. Grant accepted a position as client relations coordinator that same month, a real job with real responsibilities, but none of the ownership authority that had led to the original collapse. I checked in with Curtis periodically over the following months, and by early 2025, the reports were genuinely good. Grant, it turned out, was actually skilled at client relationships when the pressure of ownership wasn't distorting his decision-making, and two of the smaller regional clients who'd left years earlier under his leadership as owner had returned once they heard the business was under new, more disciplined management. I saw Grant again in person in February 2025 at Founders Row Precision during a routine quarterly check-in I did with Curtis. Grant was on the phone with a client when I arrived, and I watched him through the glass of his office for a few minutes before he noticed me, watched him laugh at something the client said, watched him take a careful note on a legal pad, watched him handle the call with a kind of patient competence I honestly hadn't seen from him in years, maybe ever. When he hung up and saw me standing there, he looked almost embarrassed, like he'd been caught doing something he didn't fully believe he deserved credit for yet. "It's different, doing the job instead of just holding the title," he said, when I asked him how it was going. "I used to think running things meant knowing the big picture. Turns out it means knowing all the small ones first." I told him that was, essentially, the entire lesson I'd learned building Reyes Precision Supply from nothing, and it had taken me exactly the same hard way to learn it. My mother and I have spoken regularly since that afternoon in my kitchen, carefully, slowly, the way you rebuild something that was allowed to sit broken for 5 years. We had lunch together in November 2024, just the two of us, at a small cafe in Kingston, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, we talked about Ethan, really talked about him, about who he was, about the wedding, about the way he used to laugh, rather than talking around the space where those 5 years of silence had sat between us. She cried a little quietly and said, "I miss so much of your grief, Mia. I wasn't there for any of the parts that actually mattered." I told her that was true, and that I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make the lunch easier, but I was glad she could say it out loud now, because that honesty was worth more to me than 5 more years of careful, comfortable avoidance. It isn't what it was before Ethan died, and I've made peace with the fact that it may never fully be. But it's honest now, in a way it wasn't before, and honest has turned out to matter to me more than close ever did. Rosa still comes over most Sundays. She still keeps a running joke that the binder deserves its own line item on the company's balance sheet, given everything it's quietly saved us over the years. Devon, and Amara's daughter, calls me Auntie Mia now, and some evenings, sitting in their kitchen instead of my own, surrounded by people who chose me with nothing to gain, I think about how strange it is that the family you build can end up feeling more permanent than the one you were born into, simply because it was never obligated to stay. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: love that only shows up once it calculates what you're worth was never actually love in the first place. It was an investment strategy, wearing love's clothing. The people who are truly yours will show up in the empty years, the unremarkable Tuesdays, the 4-year stretches when there's nothing to gain from staying close to you. Everyone else is just waiting to see how the numbers land. I didn't buy that building to punish anyone. I bought it because I finally understood something it took me 5 years of silence to learn, that you can hold your hand out to people once, honestly, and if they don't take it until there's something in it for them, that tells you everything you ever needed to know about what they were actually reaching for. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I've got more stories like this one coming every week. Drop a comment and let me know which part of this hit you the hardest, and share this with anyone in your life who needs to hear that walking away from people who only value you conditionally isn't cruelty, it's clarity. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.